the heartland of Indiana, 1939, a child named Dean Corll was brought into the world by Arnold and Mary Corll. His birth, seemingly ordinary, marked the beginning of a life that would later unfold into a dark and complex narrative. This chapter delves into Dean's early years, painting a picture of his family life and the seeds of his future. From the outset, Dean's life was a study in contrasts and conflict. His mother, Mary, was the epitome of affection and overprotection, often coddling her frail son, who was prone to illness. This maternal overbearingness cast a long shadow over Dean, shaping his interactions and view of the world. His father, Arnold, on the other hand, stood at the other end of the parenting spectrum. A strict disciplinarian, Arnold believed in raising children with a firm hand, instilling in them discipline and a sense of responsibility. This dichotomy in parenting styles created a tumultuous environment for young Dean, one where love and strictness were in constant battle. In 1946, the fragile equilibrium of the Corll household was disrupted when Arnold and Mary decided to end their marriage. This divorce, though amicable, was a pivotal moment in Dean's life. The separation meant more than just the parting of his parents. It symbolized the division of two distinct worlds that had shaped him. His mother's influence became even more pronounced as she sought to maintain a connection with Arnold by moving Dean and his younger brother Stanley to Tennessee to be closer to their father. The reunion of Arnold and Mary in 1950 was a brief interlude of familial cohesion, ending just as abruptly 3 years later with another divorce. This period of instability culminated in Mary's remarriage to a traveling salesman, leading the family to relocate to Texas. Here, Mary and her new husband ventured into the candy-making business, creating a venture that would play a significant role in Dean's life. The Corll family's candy business in Texas, especially in the low-income area of Houston, known as the Heights, was a surprising success. This period marked a significant phase in Dean's life, where he transitioned from a coddled child to an integral part of the family business. His involvement in the candy company was a stepping stone, shaping his work ethic and business acumen. However, Dean's transition to adulthood was not without its challenges. Allegations of inappropriate conduct with a young male employee surfaced, leading to the employee's dismissal by Mary. This incident was a harbinger of the complex and troubled path Dean would eventually tread. In 1964, Dean's life took another turn when he was drafted into the U.S. Army. This experience was brief but significant, as it was during his time in the military that he began to understand and explore his sexuality. His attraction to fellow soldiers was a revelation to Dean, marking the beginning of a personal journey that was fraught with inner conflict and societal taboos. Upon receiving an honorable discharge, Dean returned to the family business, resuming his role in its operations. It was during this period that he earned the nickname Candyman, as he often stood outside an elementary school, distributing candy samples to children. This moniker, initially a term of endearment, would later take on a sinister connotation as the darker aspects of Dean's life began to emerge. The early years of Dean Corll, marked by family dynamics, business ventures, and personal discoveries, laid the foundation for a complex and troubled life. This chapter has sought to explore these formative years, providing a backdrop for the unfolding narrative of a man whose actions would leave an indelible mark on the community and history. As Dean Corll transitioned into adulthood, his life seemed to follow a conventional path. However, beneath this facade of normalcy, a dark undercurrent was emerging. This chapter examines the period where Dean's life began to veer into the shadows, marking the onset of his descent into criminality. After returning to Houston from the military, Dean stepped into a significant role in the Corll Candy Company. His involvement was more than just occupational. It was a mask that concealed his burgeoning sinister inclinations. Dean's charm and friendly demeanor, especially towards children and teenagers, earned him a positive reputation in the community. Yet this was a deceptive veneer that hid his true intentions. The Candyman persona was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed Dean to establish trust and rapport with young people, particularly teenage boys. On the other, it served as a tool for his predatory behavior. His decision to install a pool table at the factory and his habit of gifting candy and money to older boys were not just acts of generosity, but strategies to attract potential victims. In 1968, the closure of the candy factory due to business downturns marked a turning point in Dean's life. His stable routine was disrupted, forcing him to seek employment elsewhere. He secured a position as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company, a job that distanced him from the environment that had facilitated his access to young boys. This change propelled him to find new methods to attract victims, indicating a shift in his modus operandi. The most disturbing turn in Dean's life occurred when his acquaintance with David Brooks, a young boy whom he had befriended, evolved into something more sinister. Brooks, a child of a broken home, became increasingly dependent on Dean, not just emotionally but financially. This dependency laid the foundation for a relationship that would later become an integral part of Dean's criminal activities. By 1970, the true extent of Dean's malevolent nature was revealed when David Brooks discovered him sexually assaulting two young boys. This incident marked the beginning of a horrifying spree that would terrorize the community. Dean's manipulation of Brooks, including buying his silence with cash and promises, was a clear indication of his predatory and sociopathic tendencies. Dean's strategy of leveraging Brooks to lure potential victims was a calculated move. Offering money for each boy Brooks brought to him, Dean exploited the teenager's vulnerability and financial needs. This tactic not only increased Dean's access to victims, but also implicated Brooks as an accomplice in his heinous acts. The story of Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student, is a chilling example of Dean's brutality. Jeffrey's disappearance while hitchhiking and subsequent murder at the hands of Dean, who used a plywood board as a torture device, underscored the level of premeditation and cruelty in his crimes. The involvement of Brooks in luring victims like James Glass and Danny Yates, both 14, further demonstrated the extent of Dean's manipulation. The burial of their bodies in a rented boathouse signified the beginning of a series of gruesome acts that would haunt the community. The Houston community, particularly the area known as the Heights, became the ominous backdrop for Dean Corll's escalating criminal activities. This chapter delves into the period where Dean's actions shifted from predatory behavior to a series of abductions and murders, casting a dark shadow over the once tranquil neighborhood. As the 1970s dawned, the Heights was plagued by a disturbing trend of disappearances. Young boys, often in their early teens, began to vanish without a trace, leaving families and authorities baffled and concerned. Unbeknownst to the community, Dean Corll, along with his accomplice David Brooks, was orchestrating a terrifying spree of abductions and murders. The case of Jeffrey Conan was just the beginning of a series of heinous crimes. Corll's modus operandi involved luring boys to his residence, where they were subjected to unimaginable torture on his plywood torture board. The brutality of these acts was a chilling testament to Corll's depravity. Brooks, now an active participant in Corll's crimes, played a critical role in these abductions. His familiarity with the victims, often peers from his neighborhood, made the betrayal even more profound. The boys trusted Brooks, not realizing that their acquaintance was leading them into a trap from which they would never return. The case of teenage brothers Donald and Jerry Waldrop highlighted the calculated nature of Corll's operations. Abducted while walking home, the brothers became victims of Corll's sadistic impulses. Their murders and subsequent burial under a boat shed were a grim indicator of the scale of Corll's criminal enterprise. As the number of missing boys in the Heights increased, the community's alarm grew. Parents, frustrated and fearful, implored the police to take action. Despite the mounting missing person reports, the response from law enforcement was lackluster. Authorities often dismissed the disappearances as runaways or adolescents seeking adventure, much to the anguish of their families. This period saw Corll and Brooks claim more victims, including 15-year-old Randall Harvey, 13-year-old David Hilligiest, and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle. The discovery of their bodies in makeshift graves further underscored the magnitude of Corll's reign of terror. The community's growing concern was met with inadequate responses from the police. Misconceptions and a lack of urgency hampered the investigation. allowing Corll to continue his spree unabated. The frustration of the families, coupled with the police's dismissive attitude, created an atmosphere of distrust and desperation. In the midst of this chaos, a new accomplice entered the fray. Elmer Wayne Henley, a friend of Brooks, was drawn into Corll's web of deceit. Initially misled about the nature of Corll's activities, Henley soon became an integral part of the operation, contributing to the abduction and victimization of more young boys. The reign of terror, orchestrated by Dean Corll in the Heights, a once peaceful Houston neighborhood, reached its critical point as more young boys fell victim to his sadistic crimes. This chapter examines the unraveling of Corll's sinister operations and the events leading to the shocking conclusion of his gruesome spree. As Corll's appetite for brutality intensified, so did the involvement of his accomplices, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The trio's dynamic, marked by manipulation and fear, evolved into a grotesque partnership in crime. Henley, initially an unwitting participant, became increasingly entangled in the web of deceit and murder. The case of Frank Anthony Aguirre, a friend of Henley's, marked a turning point for Henley's perception of his involvement. Witnessing the murder of his friend by Corll, Henley was forced to confront the grim reality of the operation he had become part of. Despite this realization, he remained trapped in the cycle of violence, driven by fear and coercion. As the number of victims increased, the community's anxiety reached a fever pitch. The repeated disappearance of boys from the Heights, coupled with the lackadaisical response from law enforcement, created an atmosphere of fear and desperation. Parents' pleas for a more rigorous investigation went largely unheeded, leaving them to wonder about the fate of their sons. Corll's methodical approach to his crimes exhibited a chilling level of premeditation and cruelty. The use of a torture board, the systematic abuse, and the eventual murder of his victims reflected a deeply disturbed mind. Each new victim added to the growing list of tragedies, further shrouding the Heights in sorrow. The tipping point came with the abduction of Rhonda Williams and Timothy Curley. Henley, in an unexpected turn of events, found himself at odds with Corll. The tension escalated into a deadly confrontation, marking the end of Corll's reign of terror. In a desperate act of self-preservation and perhaps redemption, Henley fatally shot Corll, bringing an abrupt end to the series of horrific crimes. The aftermath of Corll's death was a complex mix of relief and horror. Henley's call to the police not only confessed to the murder of Corll, but also unveiled the extent of the atrocities committed over the years. The revelation of the numerous murders sent shockwaves through the community and law enforcement. The police investigation following Corll's death uncovered the gruesome reality of the crimes. The discovery of the torture board, along with evidence of the heinous acts committed, painted a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by the victims. The recovery of the bodies from various burial sites brought a tragic closure to many families, while simultaneously exposing the magnitude of Corll's brutality. Henley and Brooks were arrested and faced trial for their roles in the crimes. The trials brought to light the disturbing details of the murders, leaving the community and the nation reeling. The testimony of the accomplices, the evidence presented, and the accounts of the surviving victims painted a chilling portrait of a serial killer who had operated with impunity for years. The discovery of Dean Corll's heinous acts sent shockwaves through Houston's The Heights neighborhood and beyond. This chapter focuses on the aftermath of Corll's crimes, the impact on the victims' families, the trials of his accomplices, and the broader societal reflections on the tragedy. The immediate aftermath was marked by a mix of grief, anger, and disbelief. Families who had held out hope for the return of their missing children were now faced with a devastating reality. The uncovering of the burial sites turned spaces like the boat shed into somber symbols of loss. Each recovered body brought a tragic end to the family's agonizing wait, while providing a grim closure. The trials of Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks drew national attention, highlighting the depth of Corll's manipulation and the vulnerability of his accomplices. Henley and Brooks, both young and impressionable when drawn into Corll's orbit, faced the consequences of their involvement. Henley, despite his eventual role in ending Corll's spree, was sentenced to life in prison, as was Brooks. These trials raised questions about culpability, influence, and the psychology of criminal partnerships in the community. The trials and the revelations about Corll's crimes led to intense introspection. Questions were raised about how such atrocities could have occurred unnoticed for so long. The perceived failures of law enforcement to adequately investigate the initial missing persons reports were particularly scrutinized. This period led to calls for changes in how missing children cases were handled. The tragedy also prompted a broader societal discussion on the nature of evil and the psychology of serial killers. Dean Corll, once a seemingly benign figure in the community, had harbored a dark and twisted nature. The stark contrast between his public persona and his private atrocities challenged common perceptions of criminality and mental health. The victims' families, united in their grief, sought solace in community support and, in some cases, activism. The tragedy propelled some family members to advocate for more effective law enforcement responses to missing persons cases and for support systems for families of missing children. Their efforts contributed to a growing awareness of the issues surrounding child abduction and homicide. Reflections on Corll's life and crimes also led to discussions about the role of upbringing and environment in shaping an individual's path. Corll's complex relationship with his parents, particularly his mother, was examined as a possible factor in his psychological development. However, these considerations did not mitigate the horror of his actions, but offered a lens through which to understand the origins of such deviant behavior. In the years following the discovery of the murders, the Heights community worked to recover from the trauma. Memorials were established, and annual gatherings were held to honor the memories of the lost boys. These acts of remembrance served as a testament to the resilience of the community and the enduring impact of the tragedy. As the story of Dean Corll and his crimes concludes, it leaves behind a legacy of sorrow, lessons learned, and a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of everyday life. The echoes of this tragedy continue to resonate, serving as a cautionary tale and a call for vigilance in our communities.